A police report drawn up by the Duty Inspector of Scotland Yard on November 7, 1889, described the scene in the Egyptian room of the British Museum as follows. 12 bodies in various stages of dehydration, the skin of the victims having acquired a parchment consistency and clinging tightly to the bones, the eyeballs having shrunk to the state of dried grapes, the lungs, when opened, containing from 1.5 to 3 ounces of fine quartz sand. The 13th survivor, Oxford University professor Arthur Hargrave Wellington, was found in the far corner of the hall with no apparent physical harm. He sat on the marble floor, clutching an empty bronze candle holder in his right hand, and whispered incessantly in a language that the constable on duty described in his report as not English and apparently not European. This diary lay on my desk for 3 weeks before I decided to open it. It came from the archives of a secret Crown office that has no official name and whose existence is denied in any public document. The calfskin cover was covered with brown stains, which a forensic chemist identified as human blood, of a type matching Professor Wellington's. Inside, nestled among pages of neat academic handwriting, were 4 sheets of police reports, a fragment of a translation of a text from the Book of the Dead, and a single, broken-in-half faience amulet in the shape of a scarab, from which emanated a subtle odor that I can only describe as the smell of hot sand and something more ancient, something that has no name in modern chemistry. I will present everything in the order in which the events unfolded, according to the diary and police reports. I will not add anything of my own. The facts recorded on these pages require no embellishment. Professor Wellington was one of the leading Egyptologists of the British Empire. His reputation in the scientific community was impeccable. 22 years of field expeditions, 3 monographs published by the Royal Geographical Society, membership in the Academy of Inscriptions and Belles Lettres in Paris. When Lord Ellesmere's expedition brought back the sealed black basalt sarcophagus from Luxor in August 1889, it was Wellington who was commissioned to perform the public autopsy. The sarcophagus was found in a walled-up side chamber in the Deir el-Medina necropolis, the location of which did not match any known burial map. The owner's name, which is standard for priestly burials, was missing from the outer walls of the sarcophagus. Instead, a single repeating hieroglyphic sign ran around the entire perimeter of the lid, which the expedition's translator refused to decipher and left the camp that same night without taking his salary. Wellington recorded this fact in his diary with characteristic academic skepticism. Local superstitions regarding this object are quite picturesque, but of no scientific value. The translator, Yusuf, turned out to be an extremely impressionable person, which makes him unsuitable for serious scientific work. The sarcophagus will be delivered to London in accordance with agreements with the museum's Board of Trustees. A public display is scheduled for November 6th. Some 40 guests from the aristocracy and the scientific community are expected to attend. The autopsy was announced in The Times as the event of the season. Tickets for the private screening were handed out personally by the Lord Trustee of the museum. Among those invited were 4 members of the House of Lords, 2 Cambridge professors, a representative of the Egyptian Exploration Society, and several high society ladies who, judging by the society column in the same issue of The Times, were attracted more by the exoticism of the event than by scientific interest. The sarcophagus arrived in London in early October and was placed in the museum's storerooms. Wellington visited it twice a week, taking preliminary measurements and sketches. It was during these visits that he first recorded an anomaly, which, however, he considered insignificant. It has been observed that the air temperature in the immediate vicinity of the object is consistently 3 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit lower than in the rest of the room, probably due to the properties of basalt material and its thermal conductivity. The storekeeper is complaining of drafts. Further inspection of the ventilation system is advisable. On November 6th, at 8 o'clock in the evening, 42 guests gathered in the Egyptian hall. The gas jets were turned up to full blast. The sarcophagus stood on a specially made pedestal in the center of the hall. Wellington began the autopsy procedure at 8:20 past 8. According to his notes, made directly during the procedure and distinguished from the rest of the text by a more hasty handwriting. The first bandages were cut off without any difficulty. The mummy was in excellent condition, significantly better than expected for an object of its age. The linen shrouds had not yellowed or decayed. The resin with which the outer layers of the wrapping were impregnated retained the smell of fresh resin, although at least 3,000 years had passed since the embalming. At 8:44 a.m., Wellington cut away the last outer layer of the diapers from his chest. The diary entry on this page abruptly ends, mid-sentence. The next entry was made in different ink and, according to the handwriting expert, with a noticeable lack of hand coordination. Amulet, black scarab. I shouldn't have taken it off. Museum curator Clement Farrow testified to police that at 8:46 a.m., all 12 gas jets in the Egyptian hall went out simultaneously. Not one after another, not one after the other, as happens when the pressure in the pipes drops. All at once. He stood at the door and saw it with his own eyes. Within 3 seconds, the room with 42 people inside was plunged into absolute darkness, and Farrow described it in his testimony as not just a visual darkness, but a physically dense one, as if the air in the room had acquired weight. Wellington recorded what was happening in his diary with a precision that, in retrospect, seems almost monstrous. He continued to take notes in the darkness, from memory, restoring them immediately after one of the guests had the good sense to light a flashlight and candle. The handwriting on these pages is even. That in itself is remarkable. 21 seconds of complete darkness, recorded on a pocket watch. The guests immediately began moving toward the exit, but panic was averted by several loud voices from the men. The first thing I noticed as the lanterns faded was the temperature. The fall occurred instantly and could not be explained by a simple shutdown of the heat sources. I estimate the temperature dropped at least 15 degrees Fahrenheit in the time it takes to take one breath. 15 degrees in one breath. To understand the scale of this figure, it is enough to say that such a drop in temperature in a closed space of several hundred cubic yards in volume is physically impossible without an external source of extreme cold. Constable Bradford, who was the first to arrive at the scene 4 hours later, recorded in his report that there was frost on the inside surfaces of the window frames in the hall. In November, but far from Arctic, London. Several guests described this moment in their later testimonies. Lady Aston told the investigator that her fingers had instantly gone numb, and she believed that she had lost consciousness and was dreaming, since what was happening did not fit into any framework of ordinary experience. Viscount Chesterfield reported that he felt a sudden loss of breath, as happens when jumping into cold water. It was he who lit the flashlight, and it was its flame that allowed those present to see what had happened to the air in the hall. Steam was coming from the breath of every person in the room. Thick, dense steam, like what you get outdoors at 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. Indoors. In November. In London, where the thermometer outside that evening showed +4, Wellington noted another detail, which I reread several times, trying to find a rational explanation, but found none. The steam from the breath of those present did not dissipate. It remained in the air in motionless columns, as if the air in the hall had completely lost circulation. 42 people stood in their clouds of frozen breath, and those clouds accumulated, not disappeared. By the time Chesterfield lit the candle, visibility to the back of the room was significantly obscured. The police reports contain testimony from another witness whose name was redacted in the document on someone's later instructions. This unknown witness reported hearing a sound at the moment the lights went out. He described it as the sound of dry wood or breaking reeds, repeated over and over again, as if something large and hard were slowly beginning to move after a long period of immobility. The sound originated in the direction of the pedestal containing the sarcophagus. None of the other guests mentioned this sound in their testimony. Wellington did. At the moment the lights went out, a sound came from the direction of the object, which I qualify as crepitation, a medical term for the cracking sound produced by joints when moving, or the sound of bones rubbing against each other when broken. I heard this sound during anatomy classes at the Faculty of Medicine 20 years ago. I am certain of its identity. The source was inside the sarcophagus. Crepitus from a sealed sarcophagus. The moment the lights went out, with an instant 15-degree drop in temperature. As the Chesterfield candle illuminated the pedestal, Wellington made his final entry on this page of the diary. The entry was brief, 3 words without any commentary. The lid has been removed from the inside. Wellington was a seasoned enough scientist to understand that the first priority was to record the facts, not react to them. That's why he did what he did. While the guests retreated from the pedestal to the walls of the hall, while Chesterfield raised the candle higher and muttered something unintelligible about the malfunction of the locks, while Lady Aston demanded that a caretaker be sent for immediately, Wellington stepped towards the sarcophagus. He moved closer. He peered inside through the gap that had formed between the lid and the base, and then, according to his own notes, he proceeded with the dissection. For a man of his profession and his era, this wasn't an act of recklessness. It was an act of scientific discipline. He lived for 22 years convinced that the dead don't move. One shifted lid could not outweigh 22 years. He cut away the remaining layers of shroud from the chest area by the light of a candle held by a museum assistant, a young man named Thomas Greer. Beneath the shrouds was another layer, thinner, of lighter linen, impregnated with a composition that Wellington described as resinous, with a sharp, bitter smell that did not match any embalming substance known to him. Under this layer, on the mummy's chest, lay an amulet. The object was a scarab about 2 inches long, carved from a material I initially identified as black obsidian, but on closer inspection I doubted this attribution. The object's surface didn't reflect light when illuminated by candlelight, as polished obsidian should. It absorbed the light. It didn't reflect it, but rather absorbed it, which created a strange optical effect. The scarab didn't seem like an object lying on the surface, but rather like a hole in it. The amulet was attached to the mummy's chest with a thin thread made of a material I couldn't identify. The thread looked like human hair, but had the strength of metal. Wellington took the scarab in his left hand. He didn't cut the thread holding the amulet. He tugged at it. It snapped effortlessly, as if it had been waiting for this touch. According to his description, at the moment the thread broke, a sensation passed through the fingers of his left hand, which he compared to touching metal in the cold. Not pain, but an instantaneous loss of sensitivity, which also instantly passed. He placed the scarab in his jacket breast pocket. Thomas Greer later told the investigator that it was at that moment that he noticed a change in the walls of the sarcophagus. He didn't immediately understand what had changed, since he was looking at the professor, not the sarcophagus. But he caught a glow in his peripheral vision and turned his head. The hieroglyphs on the sarcophagus's interior surface glowed, not reflecting the candlelight. They glowed on their own, with their own light, which Greer described in his testimony as red, but not uniformly red, but pulsating, changing intensity in a rhythm similar to the rhythm of a heartbeat. He counted 7 pulses in an interval that he estimated at 10 to 15 seconds. For comparison, the pulse rate of a healthy person at rest is between 60 and 80 beats per minute. Whatever was pulsing inside the sarcophagus was beating significantly more slowly. Wellington saw the glow at the same time as Greer. The hieroglyphic symbols on the basalt walls of the object displayed blood-red luminescence. I immediately tried to recall the chemical compounds that could produce a similar effect under certain lighting conditions, and I was unable to do so. Basalt is not a luminescent material. The paints used to paint the hieroglyphs, judging by their state of preservation and composition, were standard Egyptian pigments based on malachite and ochre. Neither malachite nor ochre are luminescent. Nevertheless, the symbols glowed. The glow intensified the moment I removed the amulet. There was a direct and obvious temporal correlation between these 2 events. A direct and obvious temporal correlation. It was his way of writing down what he hadn't yet allowed himself to formulate otherwise. By this point, several guests had already seen the glow, the room filled with voices. Someone demanded that the doors be opened and a doctor sent for. Some insisted that what was happening was part of a theatrical performance organized by the museum trustees for the entertainment of the public. Viscount Chesterfield, who was standing closest to the plinth besides Wellington and Greer, later told the investigator that he smelled the odor at that moment. He described it as the smell of dry, hot air, desert, hot stone, and underneath, deeper, something organic, something he declined to specify in his testimony, citing that he did not have the words to accurately describe it. Thomas Greer found the words. In his testimony given 3 days later in the presence of an inspector and a stenographer, he said the following. It smelled like a butcher shop that had been closed for a very long time. The glow of the hieroglyphs continued to intensify. The red light no longer simply marked the symbols on the walls. It filled the space inside the sarcophagus with a steady, pulsating haze. Wellington stood 1/2 meter from the edge looking inside. Just then, from the depths of the sarcophagus, from that red haze, a hand slowly rose. Withered, covered in blackened skin, wrapped in darkened shrouds with fingers bent at an angle that does not suggest living muscles. She rose slowly and with effort, like the hand of a man who has lain motionless for a long time and is just beginning to remember how to do it. She stopped in midair at the level of the rim of the sarcophagus, and she began to slowly turn toward Wellington. Thomas Greer dropped the candle. It was the first involuntary motor reflex recorded in the hall after the hand appeared. The candle fell on the marble floor and did not go out. It continued to burn, lying on its side, casting long, swaying shadows on the ceiling, and in this uneven light, the hand over the edge of the sarcophagus looked even more improbable, even more incompatible with any experience that an educated British scientist could accumulate in 53 years of life. Wellington did not retreat. This is documented in the testimony of 3 witnesses who were close enough to see his face. He stood motionless, looking at his hand with an expression Chesterfield described as that of a man performing complex calculations in his mind. Not fear. Calculations. Wellington later reconstructed what happened in the next few seconds in his diary, since he did not make any entries at the time of the event. The hand moved with a speed that belied the previous slowness of its movements. I didn't have time to react. The fingers closed around my neck below my left ear and squeezed my trachea with a force that I would estimate to be significantly greater than the physical capabilities of a person of comparable build. The skin on my hand felt like the dry leather of an old book binding stretched over a hard material. There was no softness of subcutaneous tissue, no warmth. The subject's skin temperature was significantly lower than the room air temperature, which in itself is physically abnormal for an object that has not been in contact with a cold source. The pressure on the trachea increased evenly and methodically, as if the force producing it was not spontaneous but conscious and controlled. Conscious and controlled. Wellington emphasized this distinction twice in the text. For him, as a scientist, it was fundamental. There was a fundamental difference between mechanical, convulsive muscle contraction and targeted, calculated pressure. The first could have a physiological explanation. The second could not. There was a cry in the hall. Several voices at once, male and female, and this cry finally moved those who had been standing in a daze. 2 men rushed to the pedestal and grabbed Wellington by the shoulders, trying to pull him back. The grip didn't let go. She held him with the same methodical force, and for a few seconds an absurd picture was created. 2 living people were pulling the professor in one direction, and something inside the sarcophagus was holding him by the throat in the other. Then a sound emanated from the sarcophagus. Greer described it in his testimony as the creaking of old wood under heavy load, but wetter, more organic. Chesterfield said it was a sound like the cracking of joints, but amplified many times over, as if it were not just one joint that was moving, but the entire skeleton at once, after thousands of years of complete immobility through the resistance of withered ligaments and stiffened tendons. Several guests in their testimony were unable to describe the sound at all and simply wrote that it was incorrect. The mummy was sitting up in the sarcophagus. Slowly, with an effort that was physically audible, the torso rose from a horizontal to a vertical position. The hand clutching Wellington's throat served as a support, his body the fulcrum around which this ascent unfolded. The two men who had been pulling the professor back released him and retreated. Witnesses described this moment differently, but their testimonies were completely consistent on one point. When the mummy's upper body rose to a vertical position, the head turned. She didn't flinch, didn't fall sideways under the force of gravity. She turned, slowly and with obvious intention, from the position in which she had rested for 3,000 years to facing the hall. Wellington described what he saw in front of him, inches away, in a single sentence. There were no eyes in the sockets. In the sockets there was darkness, and that darkness was looking. The hand relaxed. Wellington fell back on his colleagues, who had not managed to get far enough. There were marks on his neck that the police doctor noted during his examination. 4 stripes of deep hyperemia of the skin, located exactly as the 4 fingers of a human hand are located, and 1 stripe from the thumb. The size of the prints corresponded to a large male hand. The depth of the indentation indicated a force sufficient to fracture the laryngeal cartilage if the force were continued for another 30 to 40 seconds. The mummy sat upright in the sarcophagus. The hall was silent, and then the empty eye sockets slowly moved from Wellington to the rest of the audience, scanning the room with the same methodical awareness with which the hand clutched the throat. This was no random movement. It was an inspection. Lady Aston took a step toward the doors. The doors didn't open. Lady Aston leaned her full weight on the right door, then on the left, then on the right again. The wood did not creak. The hinges did not move. The lock did not clang. The doors stood as part of the wall, as if they had never existed as a separate, movable object, as if they had been carved from a single piece of stone along with the surrounding masonry. Viscount Chesterfield walked up to her and leaned his shoulder against hers. The result was the same. 2 other men joined them, and 4 grown men, weighing a total of at least 600 pounds, pressed on the doors without producing any visible effect. Thomas Greer rushed to the side service exit at the far wall of the hall. He pulled the handle. Nothing. He hit it with his shoulder. Nothing. I tried to insert the key I carried as a museum employee and discovered it wouldn't fit. Not because the lock was locked from the other side. It simply wouldn't fit, as if the keyhole was solid, as if the door didn't have a locking mechanism at all. Wellington watched all this, standing 5 steps from the plinth, holding his neck with his left hand. He breathed. He took note. All exits from the hall were inaccessible. The physical blockage had no mechanical explanation. The hinges and locking mechanisms I examined were in good working order and were not locked from the outside, according to Greer's testimony. However, the doors refused to budge under any force. I attribute this to an external force of unknown origin. The guests began to show signs of acute panic. Several women were screaming, 2 men were screaming with them, and one of the Cambridge professors sat on the floor and clasped his head in his hands. That's when the sand started pouring. Those closest to the pedestal were the first to feel it. Greer described the sensation as a needle jabbing him in the cheek, then another, then several at once. He decided they were fragments of something and raised his hand to cover his face. His palm was covered in tiny particles, almost invisible but clearly noticeable on his skin. Chesterfield found sand on his lips and spat it out. Lady Aston stepped away from the door because she felt it in her eyes, fine and sharp like crushed glass. The sand had no source. It didn't rain down from above, nor did it rise from below. It appeared in the air, as if the air itself were gradually turning to sand. Its quantity increased. At first, it was just an unpleasant tingling sensation. Then it became painful. Then several people started coughing, covering their faces with sleeves and handkerchiefs. The single Chesterfield candle lying on the floor where Greer had dropped it flickered in the growing sand cloud, its circle of light narrowing as it was eaten away by the dust. Wellington turned to the pedestal. The mummy still sat upright in the sarcophagus, but now the air around the pedestal was moving. Not ordinary convection, not a draft. Rotation. Slow, concentric, with a pedestal in the center, as if the pedestal were the axis around which the entire space of the hall was organized. The sand in this area swirled more densely and quickly, forming a kind of funnel, the lower end of which rested against the sarcophagus. I observed the formation of a localized vortex flow in a closed room with no visible source of air pressure. The rotation speed of the particles increased. The distance from the perimeter of the vortex to the pedestal gradually decreased, indicating a concentration of the flow. The temperature in the room continued to drop despite the fact that I couldn't identify the source of the additional cooling. Steam was coming from my breath. The floor beneath my feet was covered with a thin layer of sand. Someone broke a window. A Cambridge professor named Edward Morris, the same one who had been sitting on the floor, stood up, picked up a chair, and threw it at the nearest window. The glass shattered. Night air and street noise rushed through the breach, the distant clatter of hooves and the echo of voices from Great Russell Street. Several people rushed to the window, clearly intending to climb out. A gust of wind entering through the breach struck the sandstorm above the pedestal and scattered it for a second. Just for a second. Then the whirlwind gathered again, denser and faster, as if the outside air had given it additional energy instead of quenching it. Those who had reached the broken window stopped. Morris was the first to understand why, and told the others so in a voice that was described in his police testimony as completely flat, which in itself indicated a certain degree of shock. There was sand outside the window too. Not the whole street, not all of London. It was outside this window, a few yards from the museum wall, that a thick, reddish cloud of fine sand hung in the November air, through which the gas lamps of Great Russell Street could barely be seen. Passers-by on the street, judging by the lack of any reaction from the outside, did not see or feel this cloud. It existed only here, only around this building, only for those inside. The sand in the hall continued to thicken. The vortex above the pedestal reached the ceiling and began to expand, and the mummy in the sarcophagus slowly raised its second hand. Wellington later wrote that it was at this moment that he stopped searching for an explanation and began to observe. This distinction in his diary seems almost clinical, almost surgical in its precision. Until this moment, part of his consciousness continued to work in the mode of scientific hypothesis, going over possible mechanisms, possible errors of perception, possible coincidences. After the mummy raised its second hand, that part of its consciousness fell silent. Not from fear, from the sufficiency of the data. It watched. The creature rose from the sarcophagus with the same methodical awareness with which it had previously sat in it. Not jerkily, not spasmodically, not with that twitching mechanics that the superstitions of the rabble ascribed to the risen dead. Slowly. Controlled. The right leg crossed over the edge of the sarcophagus and landed on the pedestal, then the left. The creature stood on the pedestal at full height, and Wellington estimated its height at approximately 6 feet 2 inches. The shrouds on the lower part of the body had parted as he moved, revealing withered shins the color of old wood, covered with skin that had not a single fold, because there was no fat and almost no muscle tissue underneath, just bone and skin stretched between them like a drumhead. But that wasn't what Wellington was looking at. He was looking at the head. The skull was covered with preserved dark brown skin, devoid of hair. The facial muscles have completely atrophied, revealing the skull's bone structure in its pure geometric form. The cheekbones, the brow ridges, the jawline. The lips had shriveled and retracted, revealing teeth that were intact and properly aligned. The teeth were white, not yellowed or decayed as one would expect from a 3,000-year-old subject. White, like a living man in his prime. I noted this discrepancy and found no explanation for it. The eye sockets were empty. Wellington knew this from the first glance. But now that the creature stood at full height on the pedestal, and he could see it from a distance of several yards in the light of the growing red glow from the walls of the sarcophagus, he was able to notice what he had not noticed before. The eye sockets weren't simply empty. There was something in them that kept the gaze from wandering, something that held the gaze with the same compelling force as a hand gripping the throat. The darkness within these two depressions was active. It wasn't simply absent like light, it was present as something distinct. Greer tried to describe it differently in his testimony. He said that when he looked into the eye sockets, he had the conviction that there was someone there. Not something. Someone. Very old and very angry, looking out from inside that withered skull with a patience that is incompatible with the human perception of time, with the patience of a being for whom 3,000 years of immobility in a sealed sarcophagus were not a prison, but an expectation. The swirl of sand above the pedestal died down the moment the creature rose to its feet. It simply stopped, like a mechanism that has completed its function. The sand settled on the floor in a thin, even layer, coating the marble with a reddish crust. The hall became almost silent. Only the rapid, ragged breathing of over 40 people and the distant street noise beyond the broken window. The creature stood on the pedestal, motionless. It surveyed the hall. This wasn't a random head rotation. The head turned slowly, sequentially from left to right, pausing on each group of people for 2 or 3 seconds, as if taking stock. It was as if something inside this skull was methodically registering those present, evaluating them, classifying them according to some principle inaccessible to the living. Several people could not stand this gaze and turned away. Morris did not turn away and later told the investigator that when the empty eye socket stopped on him for those 2 or 3 seconds, he felt a cold sensation inside his chest. Not externally, not on his skin, but internally, as if something very cold and very foreign had touched his lungs from the inside. The sensation passed when he turned his head further. He hadn't told anyone about this before the interrogation and subsequently asked the investigator not to include this fragment in the official report. The investigator did. The head completed a full rotation and stopped. The creature stared straight ahead at Wellington, Chesterfield, and several other men huddled in a loose group at the left edge of the pedestal. Then its jaw dropped, slowly, through the resistance of dried-up ligaments, with the same wet crunch that several witnesses heard when the torso was raised. A mouth opened, revealing white, living teeth and a black, dry cavity behind them. From this cavity came a sound, not a groan, not a howl, not a roar. The sound Wellington described with the only word he knew, while acknowledging its inadequacy. Speech. It was speech. Low, guttural, dry as parchment, as if the vocal cords remembered their function but forgot the moisture. The language was unfamiliar, but it had structure, it had grammar, it had the intonation of a question or a command, and it had something else that Chesterfield, in his testimony, identified as intent. The creature spoke, and then a withered finger rose and pointed. The finger pointed at Lord Henry Aston, not at Lady Aston, who stood closer and more visible in her light dress, not at Wellington, who was closest to the pedestal. It was Lord Aston, standing in the center of the hall, behind the others, partially obscured from view by several figures. The creature chose him from among 42 people with the same precision with which a surgeon selects the right instrument from a row of identical ones. Lord Aston was 61 years old, a member of the House of Lords, chairman of the Board of Trustees of the British Museum, the man who signed the permit for the sarcophagus to enter the country and organized this evening's event. The investigator subsequently specifically noted this fact in his report without giving it any interpretation, simply recording it as a detail. The creature pointed to the man directly responsible for the sarcophagus's presence in this hall. Lord Aston didn't move. This wasn't bravery. It was paralysis. Chesterfield, who was standing next to him, told the investigator that Aston stopped breathing the moment the finger was pointed at him. He didn't lose consciousness or fall. He simply stopped breathing and stood there with his mouth open, no longer steaming. Chesterfield nudged him with his elbow. Aston didn't react. His gaze was directed at the creature, and in that gaze, according to Chesterfield, there was neither fear nor pain. It was blank, like the gaze of a man staring at a bright light he can't see but can't look away from. Wellington recorded what he saw from a few yards away. The subject pointed the extended index finger of its right hand towards Lord Aston and maintained that position for a period of time which I estimate to be between 8 and 12 seconds. During this time, Lord Aston remained motionless and, from my observations, did not breathe. The changes in his appearance began around the 5th second. I observed them with sufficient accuracy to reconstruct the sequence. The hair was the first to change. Lord Aston had dark blonde hair, slightly graying at the temples, characteristic of his age. It changed in a matter of seconds, not gradually, not strand by strand. A wave of change passed through my head, from the back of my head to my temples and forehead, like a wave across the surface of water from a thrown stone. Wherever this wave passed, my hair turned white. Not gray, not silvery. White, like fresh limestone, like the first snow, like a substance from which all living matter has completely disappeared. In 3 seconds, Lord Aston acquired the head of an 80-year-old man. Then his skin began to change. Chesterfield stood 2 steps away from him and saw this in detail, which he later refused to repeat to the investigator twice and asked to be recorded in the protocol only once. The skin on Aston's face began to visibly lose moisture. That's the only way to describe what was happening. It didn't wrinkle or sag as happens with aging. It tightened. It sank inward toward the bones, like the skin on a drum dries and tightens. Her cheekbones became more prominent. The temple pits deepened. The contours of his eye sockets were visible beneath the thinning skin with an anatomical clarity impossible in a living person. Lord Aston was alive. This was confirmed by the fact that at one point he blinked. Once. Slowly. Then the skin on his hands, visible from beneath his cuffs, began to darken. Not blue, as in asphyxiation. Darkening, like wood darkens with time and heat. Browning. Shrinking into fine transverse ripples, losing turgor so quickly that it was visible to the naked eye. The fingers on his hands began to draw closer together, bending toward his palm, not because he was bending them, but because the drying tendons were pulling them into a bent position, like drying skin pulling fresh parchment. Several people in the hall were shouting. Lady Aston did not shout. She stood 3 yards from her husband and looked at him with an expression that Greer described in his testimony as complete incomprehension, as if she were absolutely convinced that she was seeing something that could not be, and this conviction protected her from the realization that it was there. The creature on the pedestal didn't move. It simply held its finger pointed. Wellington recorded the final scene. Lord Aston collapsed. I use that word because I can't find a more accurate one. His body didn't fall. It lost its structural integrity while standing. His clothes sank to the floor in a split second, and there was nothing heavy in them, in the empty coat sleeves and empty trousers. Just a thin layer of grayish-beige powder evenly coating the inside of the fabric. The smell in the immediate area changed. The smell of hot sand was joined by the dust of old archives and something more pungent, which I identified as bone meal. The clothes lay flat on the floor, as if nothing had ever been inside. On the pedestal, the creature slowly lowered its hand and turned its head. It was searching for the next one. The darkness above the pedestal wasn't an absence of light. Wellington recorded this distinction with a meticulousness that by this point in the evening seemed to be the only way he could maintain functionality. He wrote quickly, and his handwriting remained legible, although the letters became smaller and more crowded, as happens when the hand moves in time with accelerated breathing. A dark spot was forming in the air above the pedestal, approximately 3 feet above the object's head. Its boundaries were clear, like the boundaries of an object, not like the boundaries of a shadow or an area of low light. It didn't diffuse at the edges. It broke off. The spot's size grew. It did not expand evenly in all directions, but rather downwards, towards the object, as if descending upon it or forming around it. The red glow of the hieroglyphs on the walls of the sarcophagus began to fade at that moment, as if the energy that fed them was being redistributed into this new formation. He looked away from the diary and into the darkness above the pedestal. It was a mistake. He himself classified it as an error 3 pages later when he reconstructed the sequence of events in a more coherent state. Looking directly at the darkness was wrong, not because it caused physical pain or damaged my vision, because the darkness stared back. And there was something in that reciprocal gaze that immediately began to destroy the inner architecture of anyone who dared to bear it. Wellington lowered his eyes to the diary after a few seconds. He wrote that those few seconds subjectively lasted much longer. He wrote that during those seconds, he had a distinct awareness of what was looking at him from the darkness. Not an image, not a face. Knowledge. Direct and immediate, like the knowledge of a burn from touching hot metal, bypassing all intermediate stages of comprehension. He did not write down the content of this knowledge. On the diary page where this entry should have been, only one word remained, written larger than the rest of the text and outlined several times, as if the hand returned to it again and again while thinking about the next phrase. The word was ancient. By this point, he had already found the required section in his translation sheet, section 125 of the Book of the Dead, apotropaic formulas directed against those who had risen from the duat. He read the translation, and as he read, his expression, according to Chesterfield, who at that point had given up trying to open the door and was simply standing by the wall, slowly changed. Not from relief, from understanding. I realized the fundamental mistake that Egyptology had made throughout its history as a discipline. We read these texts as religious literature, as poetry, as a metaphorical expression of ideas about the afterlife. We applied to them the same hermeneutic apparatus we apply to Homer or the Bible, and we were fundamentally mistaken. This is not poetry. This is technical documentation. Every formula, every incantation, every description of procedure is written with a precision that I can only compare to that of a surgical manual or a military regulation. The priests who created these texts described real procedures for working with real forces. They knew what they were doing. They knew what they were working with, and they knew how to stop it. He found the formula. The section on the procedure for forcing the spirit to return to duat occupied, in his estimation, about 3 columns of hieroglyphic text in the original papyrus. On his translation sheet, it fit into 8 lines. 8 lines in English, translated from the ancient Egyptian through Greek, with gaps where the papyrus was damaged, and translator's notes where the meaning was disputed. 8 lines. Wellington looked at them and realized he didn't know if they worked. He didn't know if his translation was accurate enough. He didn't know whether he should speak them out loud or write them down. He did not know whether the material components mentioned in the damaged gaps in the original text were necessary for this procedure. He knew nothing except that he had 8 lines and no alternative. He exhaled and looked up from the sheet. The creature on the pedestal was looking straight at him. It had stopped looking for the next one. It found the one who read the formulas. The head was turned precisely in his direction, and the darkness above the pedestal pulsed with a rhythm Wellington now recognized, having seen it before in the red glow of the hieroglyphs. The same rhythm. Slower than a human pulse, much slower. The creature opened its mouth and began to speak. The language was the same, guttural and dry, but now it wasn't a single phrase or an order. It was text, long, rhythmically organized with repeating structures that Wellington, as a linguist, immediately identified as anaphora. Each new segment began with the same combination of sounds. The creature was casting a spell. The scarabs emerged from the walls first, not from the cracks in the floor or the ceiling, from the walls. From the stone itself, through which they passed without visible holes, just as water passes through a porous material. They came out and fell onto the marble floor with a light, dry thud, each the size of a large coin, dark brown, and immediately began to move, quickly and purposefully, not in random directions, but towards the center of the hall, towards the people, towards the warmth and movement. There were hundreds of them, then thousands. The first bite landed on Lady Aston's ankle, and she screamed again, and this time her scream was taken up by the whole hall at once, for there were now enough scarabs to cover the floor in a continuous moving carpet, and this carpet climbed up the walls, and up the legs of those who stood near the walls, and up the pedestal, where the creature continued to recite the spell in a level voice, paying no attention to the insects, just as the one who called it pays no attention to the rain. Wellington felt the first scarab on his left hand. He didn't look down. He stared at the creature and held a sheet of paper with 8 lines of translation in his hand. Wellington began reading the formula aloud. He wasn't sure of the pronunciation. The English translation didn't provide a transcription of the original, only a semantic equivalent, approximate, and in places downright questionable. He read the English words knowing that they were shadows of the ancient Egyptian words, pale copies of the sounds that 3,000 years ago were pronounced by priests over a live fire in stone halls where the walls were covered with texts that no one after them could read correctly. He read and realized it probably wouldn't work. The creature stopped, didn't end the spell completely. It paused for the length of one beat of its slow pulse and turned its head toward Wellington. There was no haste in the movement. There was something else in it, something Wellington carefully and precisely described in his diary. Attention. The creature heard the words of the formula and responded to them. This in itself was information. This meant the words were correct, that the translation, despite all its gaps and imprecisions, contained enough precise elements to be recognizable. Wellington continued reading. I recited the text evenly and without pauses, trying to maintain the rhythm that was implied in the structure of the English translation. The scarabs on my left hand continued to move up my forearm. I counted 7 bites by this point. Each one left a small, bleeding hole, about 2 millimeters in diameter with jagged edges. The pain was sharp and immediate, with no latency. I continued reading. The darkness above the pedestal began to change. It did not dissipate. It thickened, gathered, and contracted toward the center, just as the surface of a liquid contracts around an object immersed in it. The red glow, which had almost died out in the walls of the sarcophagus, returned, but now it pulsed faster, in a rhythm noticeably different from before, and this change in rhythm Wellington recorded as significant. His pulse quickened. Something was changing in the creature's state, and this something was caused by his words. The creature resumed its spell. Now they were casting simultaneously. A professor of Egyptology in a torn jacket covered in scarabs up to his elbows, with a sheet of bad translation in his trembling right hand, and a 3,000-year-old priest on a pedestal of black basalt, with regenerating flesh under torn shrouds, with empty eye sockets turned in his direction. 2 voices echoed in the sand-covered hall, one alive and hoarse with fear, the other dry and even, like the voice of a tireless machine. The creature's voice was louder. The scarabs on the floor changed their movement. Previously they moved evenly, methodically covering the space of the hall like water filling a container. Now some of them, those within a few yards of Wellington, changed direction and began to concentrate around him. Not chaotically, in a spiral, narrowing toward his feet. Greer, who stood by the wall and observed this, later told the investigator that it seemed like an order, as if the insects had been instructed to focus on a specific object. Wellington read the formula to the end of the page. Nothing happened. He finished reading and stopped, and in that stop there were a few seconds of silence, during which the creature continued to read its spell, and the scarabs continued to concentrate around his feet, and the hall continued to be locked, and the sand continued to lie on the floor, and somewhere behind him someone was quietly crying. And in those few seconds was everything that complete, final, irreversible failure means. He turned the page over. On the back, in the translator's tiny handwriting, were some notes. He never really read the notes to this particular section because he considered it marginal to his research. Now he read them at the speed of those who read when their lifespan depends on their speed. The note on the return formula read as follows. The translator notes, "The formula in section 125 is incomplete in this copy of the papyrus. According to parallel texts from the Turin Papyrus collection and fragments of the Leiden Papyrus 1, the recited formula was only one of 3 necessary components of the ritual. The second component was the physical anchor of the spirit in our world, shu, that is, a material object that connects the consciousness of a being with the space of the living. The third was fire, through which the physical anchor must be destroyed while the words of the formula are being pronounced. Without the destruction of shu, the formula of return has no power. The physical anchor." Wellington put his right hand into his jacket pocket. His fingers found what he had placed there at the very beginning of the evening, when he was still a scientist giving a public demonstration and not a man standing knee-deep in carnivorous insects in a locked room next to a creature that sucked lives. The black scarab was in his pocket. He took it out and looked at it. In the red glow, the amulet looked the same as it had at the very beginning. Not an object, but a hole in space. Absorbing light, not reflecting it. In my hand, it didn't feel like stone. It felt like an absence, like a hole in my palm. The creature on the pedestal interrupted the spell. The hall immediately became quieter, as a room becomes quieter when a mechanism that has been running in the background is turned off. Thousands of scarabs continued to move, but silently. And in this silence, their movements became almost unbearable to watch. The creature looked at the amulet in Wellington's hand. More precisely, it looked at the man holding the amulet, and for the first time that evening, something new appeared in that gaze. Wellington described it in his diary with a single word: recognition. The creature recognized the amulet, and it knew that Wellington had read the translator's note, and it knew that he understood what he must do. It stepped from the pedestal. The creature's step onto the marble floor didn't sound like a step should. It was too heavy for a body of such desiccation. Too hard, as if the foot that landed on the marble was made of a material denser than bone and heavier than flesh. The marble tile beneath the right foot cracked. A thin radio crack radiating from the point of contact. The second step left a similar crack under the left foot. The creature moved toward Wellington, and every step it took left a mark in the marble, like a weight the material wasn't designed to bear. Wellington didn't move. Not from courage or paralysis. He didn't move because he was looking around, because he needed fire, and he was looking for it. Chesterfield's single candle lay on the floor a few yards away, still burning, somehow not extinguished by either the sand or the movement of the scarabs around it. It was the first stroke of luck that evening, and Wellington didn't waste time pondering its nature. He ran toward the candle. The scarabs crunched under his feet. He didn't look down. He reached the candle in 3 seconds, dropped to one knee and picked it up from the floor. The wax was soft with heat. The flame flickered but did not go out. He clutched the candle in his left hand and straightened up. The creature changed direction. It didn't accelerate. It simply adjusted its trajectory, just as a body with precise knowledge of its target's position in space adjusts its trajectory. The distance between them was about 20 feet. Wellington assessed his speed and the time he had and realized that time was short, but it was there. He opened his right palm and looked at the amulet. I held the candle in my left hand and the amulet in my right, and I realized that immediately burning the amulet in the candle flame was the only obvious action. However, I also realized that the candle was a source of fire of insufficient intensity to destroy an object made of a material whose nature I could not identify. I observed its surface for a few seconds and made a decision. He did not touch the amulet to the candle flame. He looked around. In the far left corner of the hall, against the north wall, stood a small fireplace, used by the caretakers to warm the room during the cold months. November was quite cold. The previous evening, while preparing the hall for the event, Warden Farrow ordered it lit. Wellington had seen it 2 hours earlier when he entered the hall and saw the fire within. He didn't know if the fireplace was still burning. The distance to the fireplace was about 40 feet. The creature was between him and the fireplace, slightly to the left of the direct path. Wellington ran. Not directly toward the fireplace. He arced around the creature on the right, using the group of guests remaining near the wall as a temporary obstacle between himself and its trajectory. Several people screamed as it passed them. Someone tried to grab his arm. He pulled away without slowing. The creature turned. It didn't run after him. It turned and began moving again, this time towards the fireplace, on a shorter trajectory, and Wellington saw it in his peripheral vision and knew it would overtake him. That the creature would appear between him and the fireplace before him if he continued moving at the same speed. He screamed. Not from fear. He screamed at the group by the wall, demanding that someone stop him, distract him, do something. Chesterfield heard and understood. He later explained his next action to the investigator in an exhaustively simple manner. The professor asked, and he did it because there was nothing else left to do. He grabbed a heavy wooden chair and threw it at the creature. The chair hit the shoulder. The creature swayed, lost a step, and paused for a second, turning its head toward the new source of irritation. That second was enough for Wellington to pass by. The fireplace was burning. It was a good, even fire with a generous layer of glowing coals beneath the logs. The heat from it hit him in the face 2 steps from the grate. Wellington stopped in front of the fireplace, turned, and looked out into the hall. The creature stood 15 feet away, staring at the amulet in his hand. It no longer moved. It stood and watched with the same methodical awareness with which it had done everything that evening. And there was something more frightening in its stillness than in its movement. Because the stillness of a being with such capabilities didn't mean stopping. It meant waiting. It waited to see what would happen next. The scarabs in the hall stopped moving simultaneously. Thousands of insects froze on the floor, on the walls, on the people's clothes, covering the hall with a living, dark carpet. The silence was complete, save for the crackling of the logs in the fireplace behind Wellington and the quiet crying of several women against the far wall. Wellington lifted the translation sheet in front of him. He found the right line, the first line of the formula. He took a deep breath and began to read. At the same time, he moved his right hand back toward the open mouth of the fireplace where the heat was most intense, where the red-hot coals glowed white at their base. The creature took a step toward him. One step, quick, different from the previous ones, and this step was a response to the beginning of the formula, a reaction to the sound of words it recognized. One step, and it stopped again. It was as if something in the text held him at a distance, as if the words created something between the speaker and the one they were directed at. Wellington read and did not lower his hand with the amulet into the fire, because he had not finished reading. Because the translator's note didn't provide a precise indication of when in the formula the anchor should be destroyed. At the beginning, in the middle, at the end, or in a specific place that he could not identify without the original text. He read and held his hand to the fire and felt the heat on the back of his hand and looked at the creature, and the creature looked back at him, and something began to change in its empty eye sockets. Red light, not from outside, from within. From the depths of the empty eye sockets, a red glow began to emerge, the same one that had previously emanated from the hieroglyphs on the sarcophagus's walls. as if this energy had shifted, as if it were gathering there, deep in the skull, preparing for something. The creature opened its mouth, and instead of a spell, laughter came out. It was a wrong kind of laughter. Not by timbre or loudness, although both defied normal classification. It was irregular in structure. It had the rhythmic organization characteristic of laughter as a physiological act, repeated short exhalations with a certain frequency, but under this rhythmic shell there was something else that had nothing in common with merriment or irony in the human understanding. Chesterfield described it in his testimony as a sound that conveyed knowledge, like the laugh of someone who knows the outcome, watching those who don't yet. Wellington continued reading the formula. He read it evenly, without speeding up, without changing the rhythm, although the creature's laughter filled the hall and bounced off the walls and ceiling, creating an effect that several witnesses described as three-dimensional, as if there were several sources of sound and they were placed throughout the room. The scarabs on the floor and walls began to move again, slowly, without their previous purposefulness, as if reacting to the sound, as ripples on the surface of water react to sound. Wellington's hand, holding the amulet, was an inch from the fire. He didn't lower it into the flames because the creature's laughter stopped just as his fingers approached that distance. It stopped instantly, just like the sound stops when a mechanism is turned off. And in that momentary silence, Wellington felt what he later described with as much precision as his vocabulary allowed. I felt a pressure. Not physical pressure on the body or limbs, pressure on what's inside the skull and isn't the brain in the anatomical sense. Pressure on what processes experience and shapes a response to it. The pressure was direct and increasing, like the pressure of water when you dive. And with it came images. The images began suddenly and without warning, just as a dream begins when you fall asleep. Wellington stood before the fireplace with the translation sheet in his left hand and the amulet in his right, and at the same time he was in another place. And this other place was so complete and detailed that for a few seconds he was not sure which of the two places was the real one. He was underground. Not in a basement or a mine shaft, in a space that had the geometry of a room, straight walls and a level floor, but was made of darkness, not stone or earth. A darkness of the same quality as the darkness in the creature's eye sockets, active, present, possessing weight and temperature. The temperature was lower than any point marked on a normal thermometer. He knew where he was, not because he recognized the place, because the knowledge came with the place, embedded in it, like a name embedded in a map symbol. It was the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, which translators of the Book of the Dead traditionally described as a metaphor, a poetic space of mythology. He stood in it and knew it was no metaphor. There were shadows all around him, not silhouettes or contours, shadows in the truest sense, two-dimensional areas of absence moving across surfaces from the darkness. They moved toward him slowly and deliberately, with the same patient method he'd observed in the creature's actions all evening. And as they drew closer, he began to hear them. Not sounds, not words, pressure on that place inside the skull that isn't the brain, pressure that formed meanings. What they communicated to him had no linguistic form. It was knowledge of limb, not abstract knowledge of death as a phenomenon, but concrete, physiologically tangible knowledge of one's own finitude as an accomplished fact. It was as if time worked differently here, and what was a possible future for him was already past and fixed here. He saw himself from the outside, standing in that room, and he saw how it ended. And what he saw did not involve the surviving Professor Wellington leaving the British Museum on his own 2 feet. He saw how it would end. And then the shadows came closer. I cannot describe what followed in terms of sensory experience, since the organs involved are not sense organs in the anatomical sense. I can only record the result. At some point, I realized that what I was seeing was a deliberately created image, not reality. That it was a construct created for a specific purpose. That its purpose is for me to unclench my right hand. I unclenched my right hand. I dropped the amulet. I left it on the floor of the hall, out of reach of the fire. This was what the creature wanted. Not his life, not his ka, though that too. First the amulet. First the removal of the only instrument capable of severing his connection to the realm of the living. Wellington understood this in the vision. And I understood something else. Understood with that clarity that sometimes comes at the moment of greatest danger and which is not calm, but its precise functional equivalent. The fact that the creature is spending effort on creating this vision means that it cannot simply take the amulet. That there's an obstacle between him and the amulet. That the words of the formula he's speaking create this obstacle. That while he's reading, it can't get close enough. That the only thing he needed to do was continue reading and keep his hand closed. The vision collapsed. He was back in the hall, in front of the fireplace, with the leaf in his left hand and the amulet in his right. He didn't know how much time had passed. Judging by the heat on his right hand, which he held over the fire, it felt like it had lasted no more than a few seconds. His hand wasn't burned. He was still reading, on autopilot, at a level where words are spoken without conscious thought. The creature stood 10 feet away. It was no longer laughing. It looked at him with an expression that had no name in the catalog of human emotions because it was not human. The red glow in his eye sockets pulsed rapidly, faster than before, faster than a human pulse, with a frequency that was no longer perceived as a rhythm, but as a continuous glow with a fine tremor. Wellington looked at the translation sheet. He was on the second-to-last line of the formula. He looked at his hand with the amulet. He looked at the fire, and he realized he didn't know whether to lower the amulet into the fire before the last line or after. The creature took a step. Wellington made his decision in a split second, not because he had time to weigh his options, because the creature took another step, and the distance between them was reduced to 8 feet, and at that distance the heat from the red glow in its eye sockets was physically palpable on his face, dry and sharp, like the heat of hot metal, and that heat pressed on that place inside his skull that already knew what the pressure of the creature from within was. One more step, and it would be close enough to close his fingers around her throat again. He lowered his right hand into the fireplace. Not over the fire, into the fire. There, where the log was burning and where the heat was most intense. There, where one does not intentionally lower one's hand if the hand is part of the body, the safety of which one intends to take care of. He lowered his hand with the amulet straight into the flames and unclenched his fingers, allowing the amulet to fall onto the burning log, and did not remove his hand immediately, because he continued reading the penultimate line of the formula and could not allow himself to stop even for a second. The burn came instantly. The back of the hand and 3 middle fingers sustained injuries that a police doctor later classified as second-degree burns, with areas of third-degree burns on 2 fingers. Wellington removed his hand after a second, maybe 2, and continued reading. The amulet lay on a burning log. It wasn't making a fire. It lay there, not burning. The flames around it didn't change, didn't intensify, didn't change color. The amulet simply lay in the fire and remained an amulet, black and whole, absorbing the light just as it had been absorbing it all this time. The creature stopped. It was looking at the fireplace, not at Wellington, at the fireplace. And for the first time that evening there appeared in his movement something that might be called hesitation, if that word were applied to a being who, up to that moment, had demonstrated absolute confidence in every action. It stood motionless, staring at the amulet in the fire, and the red glow in its eye sockets flickered unsteadily, with interruptions that hadn't been there before. Wellington finished reading the penultimate line. He began the last one, and at that moment, the amulet in the fireplace cracked. It didn't split in half like a stone. A network of fine cracks spread across the surface, radiating from the center, like the glaze on ceramics cracking when there's a sudden temperature change. Light emerged from the cracks, not red, Not warm. White and cold, like light that has no source of heat, like light that is only light, without accompanying radiation. It emerged from the cracks in thin threads and immediately began to fade, like a match dying in the wind. The creature made a sound, neither speech nor laughter, a sound that Wellington described in his diary as unique, without parallel in his experience. He tried to find a comparison and found only one. This was the sound of something very large realizing that what it had considered impossible was happening. It took a step toward the fireplace. Wellington stepped aside, clearing the way, and it was a mistake, because he stepped away from where he had been standing, reading the formula, and at the same moment the creature sped up, not toward the fireplace, toward him. It shifted priorities, and Wellington realized it a split second before a withered hand, its muscles restored beneath tattered shrouds, grabbed his left wrist. The grip was different. Not like earlier in the evening when fingers closed around her throat with methodical, controlled pressure. This grip was hurried. There was an effort in her, and in that effort there was something that hadn't been there before. Urgency. The creature was in a hurry. Something about what was happening created a time constraint for it that hadn't existed before. The words of the formula created it. Wellington continued reading the last line, holding the paper in front of him with his burnt hand, trying not to look at the burn blisters on the back of his hand, not to look at the creature's fingers on his wrist. To read. Just read. Because that was all that mattered. The creature pulled him away from the fireplace. He braced his feet on the floor and pulled back, knowing he couldn't physically resist the force for more than a few seconds, and continued reading. The last line was longer than the others. It had more words. The translator provided her with a note that this segment is the most problematic from the point of view of translation due to damage in the original text, and that the given version is a reconstruction with an accuracy of approximately 70%. 70%. The creature pulled harder. Wellington lost his position and took a step towards it, a forced step, his foot moving by inertia, and this step was enough for it to grab him by the shoulder with its other hand and turn him to face it. He found himself an inch from a withered face with white living teeth and a red glow in the sockets, and this glow was now pulsing so quickly and so unsteadily that he could not look at it without feeling a pressure on the inside of his skull. He closed his eyes and finished reading the last line. Something exploded in the fireplace behind him, not loudly, not like gunpowder or gas, like a hollow object exploding from within, its internal pressure exceeding the strength of its shell. A short, intense blast of air, a click, and immediately afterward, a smell. A sharp, mineral, hot scent of burning stone, and beneath it, something more ancient, something nameless. The fingers on her wrist changed. They didn't unclench. They changed. The pressure in them became different, uneven, with gaps where a second ago there had been a firm grip. Wellington opened his eyes. The creature was looking at its hands. The regenerated muscle tissue on the right forearm changed color again, from the dark red of life to a parchment-like brown to gray to a shade that has no name in the living tissue palette. The process was the reverse of what he'd observed after Aston's destruction, and he was turning quickly, faster than he'd been moving forward. The muscle contours that had appeared beneath the skin were smoothing out. The skin was stretching tight against the bones again. The creature raised its head and looked at him. The red glow in its eye sockets was fading, not instantly, gradually, like a fire dying out when it runs out of fuel. It faded, leaving behind a darkness, but a different kind. Not the active, present darkness that watched and pressed and knew. Simply the darkness of the empty eye sockets of a 3,000-year-old mummy. The fingers on the wrist unclenched. The creature took a step back. Wellington stood and looked at him, holding in his burnt hand the translation sheet with the last line of the formula that he had just finished reading, and did not move, because he did not yet understand whether it was finished or not. The creature took another step back, and began to settle. The settlement was slow and silent for the first few seconds. The creature's knees did not bend abruptly, not with a fall, but with a gradual loss of structural tension, like a wall settling when its load-bearing element is slowly removed. First his knees, then his hips, then his torso. And in each of these successive squats there was the same methodicality as in all his previous movements, only now it worked in the opposite direction. It sank to the marble floor as a creature would after making a decision, not after falling. Wellington didn't approach it. He stood by the fireplace, a sheet of paper in his hand, and watched. He pressed his right hand to his side with his left hand, trying not to look at the burn because when he looked at it, the pain went from being a background sensation to being the primary one, and now that was unacceptable. He looked at the creature and noted, the tissue degradation process resumed and accelerated significantly after the subject knelt. The restored muscle areas lost volume and color in the same order in which they were restored: right forearm, right shoulder, chest, left forearm. The rate of degradation was 3 to 4 times greater than the rate of restoration, giving the observer the impression of accelerated reverse playback. The skin returned to a parchment-like consistency. The anatomical contours of the muscles disappeared. The ruptured veils did not heal, but the tears in them ceased to reveal the underlying living tissue. Something else was changing in the hall. The scarabs stopped moving as the creature sank to its knees. They didn't freeze, didn't pause, awaiting a new command. They simply ceased being active organisms. Those on the floor froze in their positions and began to crumble. Not instantly, but gradually, like dry clay crumbling under light pressure. Those that were on the walls fell down as a fine dry rain and crumbled upon contact with the marble. Those that had crawled onto the guests' clothes vanished right into the fabric, leaving only dark spots the size of a coin. 2 minutes later, the scarabs were gone from the hall. All that remained was their scent, sharp and insectile, mingled with the smell of hot sand and something else that Wellington in his diary called the smell of a closed space, the smell of a place where there had been no air for a very long time. The darkness above the place where the pedestal had stood dissolved. It didn't dissipate like fog. It simply ceased to exist at some specific moment, which no one present could pinpoint, because no one was looking exactly there at that time. She was, and then she was gone. And this was realized only later, when someone noticed that the ceiling moldings were visible again above the sarcophagus. The creature was kneeling in the middle of the hall, its head drooping onto its chest. She didn't fall. She sank, with the last sign of that control that had defined all his movements since waking. His hands rested on his knees, his fingers relaxed. White teeth were visible behind wrinkled lips, but not with the same intensity as before. The skin around them was darkening, dehydrated, returning to the state it had been in for 3,000 years. And then the creature began to speak. Not a spell, not a formula. Something different in rhythm, in intonation, in the character of the sounds. Wellington listened and heard in this text a structure different from anything the creature had uttered before. He was an Egyptologist with 22 years of experience, and although he had never heard living ancient Egyptian spoken, he had heard enough reconstructions, read enough transcriptions to recognize certain sound patterns. What the creature said sounded like a name, repeated, pronounced with a specific intonation pattern, with pauses at specific points. A proper name spoken by the creature that carried it for 3,000 years in a sealed sarcophagus, where it was deliberately erased from the outer walls to deprive it of its identity in the afterlife. The creature was naming itself out loud, perhaps for the first time in 3,000 years, and there was something about that naming that Chesterfield, the only one besides Wellington who heard it closely enough, described in his testimony as follows. It sounded like what a person does when he wants to be remembered. The voice grew quieter, thinner, drier, like a thread thins when it's pulled to breaking point. The object's voice faded gradually, maintaining the same rhythmic organization until the very last moment. I listened and tried to commit to memory the phonetic structure of the sounds being pronounced, realizing that I had no way of writing them down at the moment. This name, whatever it was deliberately erased from history by those who walled up this sarcophagus in an unmarked side chamber. They knew what they were doing. They knew who they were burying, and they took all necessary measures to ensure that this being could not be identified and named, because in Egyptian theology, a name is part of the essence. I have heard this name. I will not write it down. The voice uttered the last word almost silently, an exhalation, dry, like the rustle of papyrus. And then the creature crumbled, not slowly, not gradually as tissue regeneration had done, instantly. In a split second, what had been kneeling in the middle of the hall ceased to be a structure and became a substance. The shrouds fell away like clothes falling from a body that has suddenly become gas. Inside the shroud was all that remained after 3,000 years and one evening in London. A pile of fine, dry sand. Reddish, light, finely dispersed. The same one that lay on the marble floor, a few millimeters thick throughout the entire hall. The same one that was in the lungs of the 12 people who would be found here in a few hours. The same one that continued to hang outside the broken window in the November London air for several minutes after the creature ceased to exist, and then disappeared, as if it had never been there. The doors opened. Not with a bang or any effort, they simply opened, the way normal doors open under normal circumstances, when someone turns the handle. No one turned the handle. They swung open on their own, both doors, quietly and without a creak, and through them, the cold November air, with the smell of coal and horse manure and the distant fog over the Thames, entered the hall. No one ran for the exit. They stood, all the survivors in that hall, 30 of them in torn, sand-covered clothes, looking at the open doors, and no one moved for several seconds, as if freedom after imprisonment takes time to sink in. Then Lady Aston stepped out first. Silently, without a word, without looking at the pile of sand where her husband's clothes had been just minutes earlier. She walked across the hall, through the open doors, her heels clicking along the corridor with diminishing volume. The others followed her. Wellington didn't follow. He stood by the fireplace and looked at the grate where the ashes lay. Clean, grayish-white ash where the log had been and where he had dipped his hand into the fire with the amulet. No black obsidian. No shattered stone, only ash, indistinguishable from the ashes of burnt wood. It slowly sank to the floor next to the fireplace. He sat down on the marble slabs covered with a layer of reddish sand and opened the diary to a blank page and began to write, because that was the only thing he knew how to do in circumstances for which there was no other protocol. Beyond the broken window, dawn was breaking over London. In the hall, all that remained was sand, an open, empty sarcophagus, and one man, writing, and unable to stop. Outside in the corridor, the hurried footsteps of the first constables arriving in response to the call could be heard. Scotland Yard Inspector Reginald Hope arrived at the British Museum at 6:42 in the morning on November 7th. He drew up the crime scene inspection report himself, not trusting the sergeant to do so because after just the first 2 minutes in the Egyptian hall, he realized that the standard protocol was not suitable for this place. A layer of sand on the floor. 12 bodies in various stages of dehydration scattered randomly throughout the room, with no visible injuries, no blood, and no external influence that could explain their condition. Cracked marble slabs near the pedestal, a broken window, an empty sarcophagus with a lid pulled back and a reddish coating on the interior walls, which the forensic chemist later refused to identify and entered into the report as a substance of unknown origin, and one living person in the far corner by the fireplace. Professor Wellington had written 42 pages by the time the police arrived. He was sitting on the floor, leaning his back against the mantelpiece, with the diary open on his lap, continuing to write when Hope approached him. His burned right hand held a pencil. He didn't look up as the inspector approached. He finished the paragraph, put a period, and only then looked up. Hope later described his look in a report in one sentence: "The look of a man who has seen what he should not have seen, and now carries that knowledge like a physical burden." Wellington handed Hope the diary without a word. He gave evidence that same day, in the presence of an inspector, 2 sergeants, and a stenographer, for 4 hours, evenly and consistently, without hysteria and without lapses of memory. The testimony matched the diary entries in every detail. Hope noted this in his report as a complicating factor. Witnesses who have experienced traumatic events typically exhibit inconsistencies between their oral testimony and their written accounts. Wellington showed no inconsistencies. He remembered everything. That was the first sign. The second was the sand. As Wellington was being led out of the hall a few hours after the police arrived, one of the constables noticed that fine, reddish sand was slowly pouring out of the professor's left ear. It wasn't actively pouring out, but rather slowly leaking out in small amounts, like water leaking from an ear after swimming. The constable reported this to Hope. A police doctor was called for Hope. The doctor examined the professor's ears, nose, and throat and discovered traces of fine quartz sand in the nasal sinuses and lower trachea, identical in composition to the sand on the floor of the hall. Wellington didn't offer an explanation. He only said that during the vision the creature cast upon him, he smelled something, and it was exactly that: hot sand and something underneath. The doctor entered the observation into the medical protocol and refrained from commenting. The case was transferred from the regular Scotland Yard unit to what was officially known as the Special Investigation Bureau for Incidents of Unspecified Nature, which, according to several sources, was directly subordinate to a specific Crown agency. Hope handed over the case without objection and never mentioned it publicly again. The official press version was that an unidentified toxic substance had leaked into the Egyptian hall of the British Museum during the opening of an Egyptian sarcophagus, resulting in injuries and deaths among several visitors to the closed event. The investigation is ongoing. The museum is temporarily closed to visitors. This version remained in the press for exactly 4 days, after which the topic disappeared from the newspapers completely and simultaneously, which in itself is a remarkable circumstance for the publishing market, where competition between publications under normal conditions does not allow a sensational story to be simultaneously silenced. Wellington was admitted to a private hospital in Surrey, not involuntarily. He voluntarily consented to the hospitalization and signed the necessary documents. In explanation of his agreement, he wrote a short note, which was preserved in the file and which I held in my hands. "I am completely sane. This may be part of the problem. The man of sound mind who knows what I know is a source of inconvenience to all who choose not to know it. I agree to hospitalization for one reason. I need time and silence to write down everything I remember while I still remember it correctly. The walls of the hospital will provide these conditions more reliably than anything else." He spent the rest of his life in the hospital, not because they wouldn't let him out. They did. He left her for a few days several times, visiting colleagues and going to libraries. But he returned each time, explaining that life was more difficult for him outside her walls. He never specified what exactly was more difficult. Except once. One of the doctors at the asylum, a young man named Thomas Carr, who later became a famous psychiatrist and left behind extensive memoirs, recorded in his diary the following conversation with the professor, which took place about a year after his admission. Carr asked Wellington what exactly prevented him from living outside the hospital. Wellington didn't answer right away. He was silent for a long time, looking out of the window at the garden trees, and then he said the following, and Carr wrote it down word for word because the words were the kind you don't forget. The professor said that when he burned the amulet and finished reading the formula and the priest's spirit returned to the duat, he heard something. Not a sound. Something perceived by that place inside the skull that is not the brain in the anatomical sense. He heard the door between worlds closing, and he heard something escape at the very last moment, a split second before the door closed. Carr asked what it was. Wellington turned from the window and looked at him. He said he didn't know what exactly, that he didn't have the tools to identify what was emerging through the closing door between worlds in a split second, that he only knew one thing. It was looking for a body. That the spirit, deprived of its body and its anchor, needs a new vessel. That 3,000 years of immobility in a sealed basalt sarcophagus do not destroy intent. They concentrate it. He's not dead. He was never dead in the way ordinary people are. He was imprisoned. Now he's free again, only without a body. London is big. The streets are full of people. Each of them carries within themselves what they need. I am here because these walls, this silence, these procedures create a certain barrier. Not a reliable one, but the best one available to me. Carr wrote this down and asked what kind of barrier the asylum created. Wellington said, "A busy mind." He said, "An empty mind is an open door." That boredom, loneliness, apathy, melancholy, any state in which the mind stops working actively and begins to wander without direction, is a state in which the door opens. That his mind is occupied in the hospital. Doctors, procedures, his roommates, their stories, their illnesses, constant material for observation and analysis. On the streets of London, he said, there are too many people walking somewhere and thinking about nothing. It's not their fault, they're just walking. But it's precisely in these people, walking somewhere and thinking about nothing, that the door is open. Carr closed his diary and sat in silence for a while. Then he asked one last question. How will the professor know if this happens? If the spirit finds the body? Wellington turned back to the window. He said he wouldn't know. That the one who becomes the new vessel won't know either, at least not right away. That this isn't an instantaneous process. It's like how the smell of a room slowly changes when something with its own scent is brought in. Gradually, imperceptibly, until one day it's too late to notice. He added one more thing. If somewhere in London a person suddenly discovers that he knows a language he never learned, that he hears sounds that aren't there, that his pulse has become slower than it should be, this will mean the priest has found what he was looking for. And it can no longer be stopped the way I stopped him at the museum, because this time there will be no anchor. The anchor will be a living body, and it can't be burned in the fireplace. Carr finished the entry and never asked Wellington about it again. The professor died in 1903 in the same hospital where he spent 14 years. The official medical report listed the cause of death as pneumonia. The doctor who signed the report noted in a separate internal note not intended for official use one circumstance that he considered insignificant. During the autopsy, a small amount of finely dispersed quartz sand was found in the professor's lungs. It was of the same composition as the sand found on the floor of the Egyptian Hall of the British Museum. The diary, police reports, witness statements, and Carr's notes were deposited in the Crown Office archives, where they languished for 37 years before ending up in the file I held in my hands. The sarcophagus was returned to the museum's storerooms, empty. Around 5 million people lived on the streets of London in 1889. Many of them were walking somewhere, thinking about nothing.